Rocky Ridge.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and as always, it's an honor and a privilege to rise in this place. And today, in some ways, perhaps more than others, because I will be only one of a handful of members that will have the opportunity to debate this bill at second reading. So, we have heard already today, as we debated the time allocation motion, about how this is an 800-page omnibus bill that is going to be now debated under the guillotine of time allocation. And this is not a scenario where debate having become stale or an opposition filibuster was looming, that a government had to move time allocation. This is an example of a government that is simply trying to ram through an 800-page bill without proper debate. There really is no other explanation for what is happening right now. So this bill is an omnibus bill. It contains, as was mentioned by the member during debate on time allocation, the member for Kamloops Thompson Caribou, a bill that contains within it 3 bills on Indigenous policy. We understand it contains 2 transportation bills, changes to some 20-plus statutes. And this government has allocated a truncated now day today plus last Friday for debate on it. And it is a shame, Mr. Speaker, and it is shameful in particular because this government campaigned heavily on the issue of omnibus legislation. They promised that they would never table omnibus bills. They promised that they would change the standing orders to prevent any government from tabling omnibus bills. And yet, though, amid the debacle in the spring of 2017 over changes to the standing orders, the result was a change to the standing order that did give the Speaker some power to split a bill. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, that is what is before us now. We are debating this bill with the limited time that we have without knowing yet if the bill will be divided. So, Mr. Speaker, with every minute that passes, we're closer to having to vote on this bill without clarity as to what we'll be actually voting on. The members, the NDP had requested to have this bill split. And we don't know yet, Mr. Speaker, what your ruling is going to be, and so it is difficult to be able to digest. It's difficult enough to digest an 800-page bill, and here we are debating it without even knowing what the final vote is going to be put to the House later today. So that is it's a shame that we're so hopelessly rushed on this debate or on this bill, and this bill, though, is a culmination of several Liberal broken promises. They promised heavily. In my writing, it came up actually fairly often during the campaign. People talked about omnibus legislation, and this bill, parties promised never to table an omnibus bill. They promised never to allocate to invoke closure, and they also promised that they would balance the budget by 2019. They actually went out of their way in their campaign to differentiate themselves from both the Conservatives and the NDP, who had, in our own ways, promised balanced budgets. A key point of differentiation that they took to the doors was that they would run a modest $10 billion deficit for a maximum of 3 years and return to a balanced budget by 2019. So they were elected on a promise to run a modest deficit solely for the purpose of funding an infrastructure program. This was not to be a structural deficit. This was not to be a deficit through which to fund ongoing program expenditure. This was a capital deficit that they were going to run in order to fund infrastructure, and infrastructure only. This is what they took to the doors, and this is the premise upon which this government was elected, the primary one. And so, Mr. Speaker, They've broken their promise on omnibus bills, they've broken their promise on closure, and they are hopelessly, helplessly breaking their promise over and over again on debt and deficit. So, Mr. Speaker, if we look at this bill, at 800 pages combined with the 400-odd pages each in the spring BIA and the budget itself, we're up to 1,600 pages of budget bills tabled in this House without mention of a return to balance, without mention of any kind of a plan to return to a balanced budget. So, Mr. Speaker, this was a promise. This isn't something that Conservatives would just fixate on because this is what we promised in the election and this is what we think they should do. They actually took it to their own voters. People that voted for this Liberal Party voted for a party with an expectation of a balanced budget by 2019. And it hasn't happened. It isn't going to happen. We see now that this government has been lucky. They've walked into a stronger than expected world economy. They've been lucky on interest rates. They've been lucky on real estate inflation. They've been lucky by receiving another $20 billion in unbudgeted revenue that they have blown through as well without being able to balance a budget. And so we know that the Finance Department's own numbers say that they will not balance the budget until 2045. How could this government and its members, the governing party members, how could they possibly take this to the doors in 2019? They didn't promise their talking points on maintaining a low level of debt to GDP. That isn't what they promised, Mr. Speaker. Now, on this Implementation Act, which contains no plan for a balanced budget, they neglect to address an important issue from the budget itself. The budget on page 290 commented then on the $20 price differential on Alberta crude. And the budget said that this addressed this as a concern, that this was an issue for revenue projections going forward, that at $20 a barrel, that the differential on Canadian crude, price differential on Canadian crude, was a concern and a threat to future revenue projections. However, the budget claimed that the differential would shrink in the year ahead. They said in their budget that the differential would was expected to shrink from $20 to $15, and this would be good. And their forward revenue projections assumed a reduction in the differential. They said the differential would shrink because new pipelines will be built, because the Trans Mountain expansion would go ahead and get Alberta crude to Vancouver, where it could be taken to refineries in California, where the heavier oil would get a much better price than being taken by rail to Oklahoma or to not go anywhere for lack of any transportation capacity. So we all know, Mr. Speaker, that has not happened. We are here today with a $50 differential. So what is that going to do to the revenue projections? They're already expecting it to shrink. It's ballooned out to $50 per barrel. So there is no plan for a balanced budget. We know that their revenue is threatened by the differential on oil. It's substantial. It's billions of dollars of tax revenue that is at stake in the differential. So we have an 800-page bill that we've got a few hours to debate. It has complicated 300 pages, actually, on its pay equity section, I understand. We've got complicated labor code changes. We've got an intellectual property component. We have new CRA components to this as well that all have to be dealt with somehow in a short period of time. And yet this BIA gives us more spending, more deficits, likely more red tape and more difficulties for small businesses, no plan for a balanced budget, no plan to fix the Alberta discount and the threat that it represents to Canadian governments, provincial and federal. And so, Mr. Speaker, I can't support this bill, and I cannot support this government for its broken promises and its shameful use of time allocation and omnibus legislation.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the intervention by my colleague today. However, I take note of his repeated attempts to say that this particular government and the Liberal Party perhaps has been lucky. You know, it wasn't luck that led to Paul Martin making sure that the right restrictions were in place when he was finance minister so that we didn't lead into the same housing crisis that the states got themselves into. It's not by luck that you become the fastest growing GDP out of the G7 nations. It's by fiscal prudent responsibility. It's not by luck when you decide to invest in real investments in infrastructure that will pay off down the road. So rather than buying gazebos, for example, we would invest in roads and bridges, putting people to work and changing the environment that we have so that people can actually continue to succeed. So I would take great exception to that. I imagine that he has a great retort for me, but at least I thought I would provide that comment, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Honourable member for Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Mr. Speaker, the member invoking the previous Liberal Prime Minister Paul Martin, he seems to have forgotten that there was another Prime Minister in between for 9.5 years. And so the good luck that I referred to is indeed that they inherited the 9.5-year legacy of the previous government that put the country's fiscal foundation is entirely on the track record of the Stephen Harper government. And indeed, you know, this Liberal government could maybe learn a thing or two from the Paul Martin government, too, while we're at it.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can assure a member across the way we are still trying to forget about those Harper days. Mr. Speaker, you know, it's interesting. You have Conservative that stands up time and time after on the budget, and what they like to talk about is the issue of deficit. And, you know, what comes to mind is when you take a look at Canada as a nation, as a history, 151 years. I believe that the Conservatives have been in government for about just less than 40% of that time, the Liberals on the other 60%. But when you take a look at the total debt, the amount of debt in total that has been created, it's like 75% of it has been as a result of Conservatives. If you compare to Stephen Harper inherited multi-billion-dollar surplus. Even before the recession, turned it into a billion-plus dollar deficit. My question, very straightforward: why would this government want to take any advice from the Stephen Harper Conservatives when they did so poorly on the issue of deficit management?
Honourable member for Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
The history of politics and the change of governments has been one of Liberals creating financial mess that a Conservative government has to come in and clean up. We'll be there for Canadians in 2019.
Questions and comments. The Honourable member for Provencher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I really enjoyed listening to that speech by my colleague from Calgary, Rocky Ridge. He talked a lot about the accumulating debt and how there's no plan to even return to a balanced budget for the next foreseeable future. And I'm wondering if the member could tell us what impact that's going to have on our children and grandchildren in years to come.
The Honourable member for Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Well, thank you. And the impact will be potentially severe if we can't get past this and reverse the track that this government is on. And I want to add to this that every provincial and territorial finance minister in Canada has at least some kind of documented plan to return to a balanced budget. The only finance minister in Canada that just simply buries his head in the sand and refuses to answer questions at committee and in this place as to when he will balance the budget. That's this finance minister. He's the only one in Canada that can't even say the words.
Resuming debate.